How many times have you heard the phrase ATP is the energy currency of the body? If you're like me, you probably heard it a lot of times before you ever really understood what that meant. I mean, how can an organic molecule be an energy carrier? And what other roles does ATP have in the body? Well, my name is Cricket Davis, and I'm here to talk with you about the different roles physiologically that ATP has. So, what are we going to cover together? First, we're going to start by talking about just the general chemical structure of ATP and how that makes it a good energy currency. We'll talk about exactly how that energy is transferred through hydrolysis. And then finally, we'll talk about another role ATP has that's also very physiologically important. And that's a phosphorylator, meaning it can transfer phosphate groups to other biomolecules. By the time we finish this lesson together, you'll be able to describe the basic properties and functions of ATP in your cells. And this will allow you to answer questions much like the one below. In order to understand why ATP is a good energy carrier for the body, we need to know the basic chemical structure. Here we see something that looks very similar to a nucleotide, with a nucleic acid and a sugar phosphate backbone. But in this case, we have multiple phosphates. So if you have just the ribose sugar and adenine, we would call this adenosine. But if we add on a phosphate, we call it adenosine monophosphate, or AMP. Add a second, and we get ADP. And then finally, with the third, we get adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Now, why does this make a good energy carrier molecule? Well, let's think about the bonds, highlighted in red. These are high energy bonds. Why do I say they're high energy? Well, we know that like charges repel. And in this case, we have many negative charges compressed closely together. You could think of this as being analogous to a spring. If you compress a spring, it requires energy input. You can stabilize it, and then when you release the spring, you release energy as well. In the same way, by compressing these negative charges together, we're storing energy. When we release some of these negative charges, we're going to release energy. So the high energy bonds of ATP make an easily accessible energy source for the body. Although ATP is a great energy carrier, it is not the highest in energy. In fact, if we take a look at this table with free energy hydrolysis, it's actually an exergonic process, releasing energy whenever we remove one of the phosphates. Why might we not use something higher in energy, like cyclic AMP or creatine phosphate? Think of it like an old vending machine that doesn't give change. If you put in $1, you get a soft drink. If you put in a $5 bill, you still just get one soft drink. If you think of it that way, whenever we break a high energy bond on a phosphate, it releases a certain amount of energy. We can couple that to then do useful work in the body. If we release much more energy and only use a small part of it, the rest of it's wasted. So although ATP is only a mid-level energy carrier, in many ways it's more efficient because it's in a smaller denomination that's more readily usable in the body. One of the most common ways you'll see ATP hydrolysis used on the MCAT is for active transport. In this case, we've got sodium-potassium pumps. You see that although we have a high concentration of sodium outside and a high potassium concentration inside, we want to actually move against that concentration gradient. Well, that's not going to happen through passive diffusion. So you might be wondering how the sodium-potassium pump gets over this hurdle. Well, in order to move these 3 sodium out and 2 potassium in, this is a non-spontaneous reaction. It's unfavorable energetically. But we do know that ATP going to ADP and phosphate is energetically favorable. So let's say we hydrolyze an ATP, and then if we add these two reactions together, we get a total reaction that becomes favorable. Now we've arrived at the last major role that ATP has physiologically. ATP, with its excess of phosphates, can be used to donate phosphates to other biomolecules. Why would we want to do that? Well, many enzymes and proteins are controlled through phosphorylation. You can think of the addition and removal of phosphate as flipping an on and off switch. So, by removing an energetically favorable phosphate, we can then add that or transfer it to another biomolecule. In fact, we can think of the energy release role of ATP as just being the phosphorylation of water instead of another biomolecule. Since it's so critical that we have an adequate supply of ATP on hand for phosphorylation and hydrolysis, we have to constantly remake it. So you can think of it as a cycle. We're constantly going from ATP to ADP and back again. Now let's apply some of what we've discussed through some practice questions. This one's about general characteristics of ATP. Go ahead and select what you think is the right answer choice. Well, we know that ATP is a mid-level energy carrier, and we know that there's some perks to being a mid-level rather than high-level energy carrier. That gives us answer choice D. Let's see how well you remember the structure of ATP. Give this problem a try. Well, since ATP contains a ribose sugar, and we know that's a component of RNA, so we probably expect to see RNA bases. Thymine isn't an RNA base. So what's the most important info about the roles of ATP for the MCAT? Well, first just remember that the highest energy carrier is not always the best. Second, the reason that ATP can be an energy carrier is because of its high energy bonds. Also remember that ATP can be used not just to directly provide energy, but to couple and make reactions that are unfavorable more favorable. And lastly, remember that phosphates can also be donated as a way of controlling enzymes or proteins. Thanks for reviewing the role of ATP with me. Just remember, you can always come back to this video or the relevant chapters in your review notes as necessary. Good luck with your prep.